of the America's biggest earthquake faults might be linked, geologists say. Provocative analysis of seafloor cores suggests that quakes on the Cascadia Fault off California can trigger tremors on the San Andreas, which is logical. I mean, they're right next to each other. Now, the controversial study argues that at least 8 times in the past 3,000 years, quakes made a 1-2 punch off the west coast of the United States. A quake hit the Cascadia Fault off the coast of North California, triggering a second quake on the San Andreas Fault just to the south. In some cases, the delay between the quakes may have been decades long. Well, we know that this is what happened with Ridgecrest. One day before, actually 13 hours before the 6.4 on July 4th, we had a Cascadia quake basically north of Vancouver Island, Canada, 6.2 magnitude, and 13 hours later we had the foreshock of Ridgecrest, the 6.4. The next day we had the 7.1. But that happened again in 2015. We had at that same location north of Vancouver Island magnitude 6.2, and it hit Ridgecrest 24 hours later with a moderate earthquake. So obviously it shows that Cascadia has something to do with San Andreas and the Walker Lane fault system as well. So a controversial study argues that at least 8 times in the past 3,000 years, quakes made a 1-2 punch off the west coast of the United States, Cascadia Fault triggering the San Andreas Fault to the south. In some cases, delay of the quakes may be decades long, but it does take place. The study suggests that Cascadia, which scientists think is capable of unleashing a magnitude 9 earthquake at any time, could set off quakes in the northern San Andreas, which runs under the San Francisco Bay Area. Several earthquake scientists told Nature that more work has to be done to confirm the provocative idea. Researchers have long considered the two faults seismically separate. Now, I would venture to say that they're so close to each other, of course they're going to trigger each other off, especially if they're big. But going on to this article again, Chris Goldfinger, geologist and paleoseismologist at Oregon State University in Corvallis, will present the findings December 13, that's just in about 5 days, at a meeting of the American Geophysical Union in San Francisco. He says, "This is mostly a circumstantial case. I don't have a smoking gun." So there are tantalizing clues, though. Goldfinger and his colleagues first suggested in 2008 that earthquakes in the southern part of Cascadia could trigger quakes on the northern San Andreas Fault. The scientists reported finding layers of churned up sandy sediment in seafloor cores drilled offshore. These layers, called turbitides, usually form when earthquakes shake the seafloor, causing underwater landslides. The researchers reported finding turbitides in Cascadia that seemed to form just before similar turbitides near the San Andreas, perhaps as the Cascadia quake triggered a San Andreas quake. But it was hard to pinpoint exactly when the turbitides had formed, and Goldfinger knew he needed more evidence. He says, "So that's what we did. We went out and got more cores." Now he has data from 7 cores drilled offshore in southern Cascadia and 7 cores drilled near the northern San Andreas. The 2 sites are around 100 kilometers apart, close enough to feel shaking from both these faults. At 8 places in both sets of cores, Goldfinger spotted unusual 2-layered turbitides and realized that they were telling him something new. He says, "Finally, the lights went on for me. The 2-layered turbitide has to be 2 quakes recorded together." Of course, doubt still remains. As Goldfinger sees it, a Cascadia quake shook the coastline first, causing landslides that show up in both sets of cores as the first layer of turbitides. Then at some later point, the northern San Andreas also shook, causing the second turbitide layer to form. "This story is pretty convincing," said Jason Patton, engineering geologist for California Geological Survey in Sacramento. He was the co-author on the 2008 paper. He said Cascadia turbidites are covered by San Andreas turbidites, so the Cascadia turbidites were deposited first. Others are reserving judgment. Turbidites show that the ground shook at some point in the past, but it's difficult to tell exactly when or where those quakes happened, says Joan Gomberg, seismologist at the U.S. Geological Survey in Seattle, Washington. Quote, all this unnecessary uncertainty leaves multiple, equally plausible interpretations on the table, most of which are not sensational, she said. For instance, the turbidites could have been formed by unrelated quakes happening anywhere across the seismically active Pacific Northwest. Ross Stein, seismologist with the earthquake preparedness firm Trembler in Redwood City in California, wants to see detailed modeling of how stress from the Cascadia fault may be transferred to the North San Andreas, and researchers generally agree that a large earthquake can sometimes trigger another on a nearby fault by transferring stress and bringing the second fault closer to failure. But it's not clear whether that might happen between Cascadia and northern San Andreas, Stein says. Next week at the conference, Goldfinger says, I'm just going to lay out the case. This was written by Alexandra Witt's Nature magazine. It's on Bended Reality. Today's quakes, Sizewell, Berkeley, and this is the San Andreas fault, as you can see here. This is the Garlic fault. San Andreas is the biggest fault in California. Garlic fault is the second largest. This is the Walker Lane fault system, and this is Cascadia. This is Cascadia. Cascadia Arc is right here. As you can see, basically it's the same thing. What can I tell you? Of course, they're so close to each other, they would logically trigger each other, especially if they were major quakes. Now, this is the Garlic fault. This is the Walker Lane fault system. This is San Andreas taking up 75% of the subduction pressure from the Pacific plate going underneath the North American plate. And the Walker Lane fault system, which is many faults put together, not just one fault, takes up about the rest of the 25% of the subduction pressure. And Walker Lane and Garlic connection right there, perpendicular joint, that's where the Ridgecrest area earthquakes took place. Walker Lane fault system is pushing in to the Cascadia Arc going north. It's also where all these high threat volcanoes are located right here. And it's pushing up into the Cascade arc going north and basically going out into the Juan de Fuca plate, the Gorda plate. So you can see how close it is. Of course, San Andreas could very well be triggered by a Cascadia earthquake. And we've seen a lot here today, 3.2, 3.5, and aftershocks as well. There's a lot going there, as you can see. This is Ridgecrest right here. This is the Long Valley Caldera supervolcano. If you'd like to join me on my Patreon account, you will hear content not covered by mainstream media. These riveting stories will be based on my research, and I will state my opinions and give my personal insight on diverse and controversial subjects and world events not covered by mainstream media, and not supported by YouTube guidelines. So whatever I have on my Patreon, most of those will not be on my YouTube channel. Please consider becoming a member today. More of the most significant and important videos will be on my Patreon channel. Your support helps me to continue my research and keeps this YouTube channel alive. And we depend on your support, your generous charity, because we help economically challenged families here in Athens, Greece, in Kapota, and we also help the young generation with university tuition and the community around our church. Thank you.